Good afternoon, everyone. I too would like to start by thanking Richard and Kevin for the very warm welcome you've given us today. I have never been in the centre before. I'm incredibly pleased to have made your acquaintance. And I'd like to thank you all for staying as wide awake as you seem to be, given that we've now been talking to you for quite a few hours. I was very glad when Andreas started his talk by talking about the fragility of human beings, because I think what I want to talk about today is not the value of dignity, which I think you will know from our speakers in your own life is a given, the way we should treat each other as human beings. But I want to talk about why we deny dignity. What is it within us that so often we fall short of our standards? I came across this question for the first time when I began to live in Northern Ireland in a place that's called the Killing Fields. It's an area that is deep in the countryside of Northern Ireland, and the reason it's called that is that it has the second highest murder rate of anywhere else in Northern Ireland, except for 1 square mile in Belfast, where we had 600 murders, neighbour against neighbour, over the 20 years. This was a very small community. It was a very safe community. It was a community where people helped each other. The young men had set up many sporting fields, facilities. My sons were so well looked after. They looked after each other and old people. We never had to lock our doors. But it was only after a few years I realized that many of those same young men who were model neighbors to us and to each other were out at night killing those people they perceived as their enemies, laying bombs, blowing up pubs, etc. And that question led me to do my doctorate on talking a bit further to people who were paramilitaries. This was before the term terrorism came into play, which is a very problematic term. Paramilitaries were from both sides, and I was interested in how come these paramilitaries, some of them at least, had turned away from bombing and shooting people and actually turned towards dialogue as a possibility for moving forward in our political question. In talking with them, I discovered a couple of things that it was interesting how their violence they always felt was justified. They felt that they were always right in taking the lives of others, but not others taking their lives. They found ways to blame others no matter what happened. And I was equally shocked by the short-term approaches of our politicians that really seem to be geared towards the next election rather than the long-term needs that we need to address. And what I became aware of was the ideologies that were so passionate for them that they were prepared not only to kill others, but also to give up their own lives. And I wondered, why was this? Why did they feel this way? About a few years ago, I came across something that led me on yet another path. I am a social psychologist, so I had explored most of the frameworks in terms of group belonging, group needs, etc. But I came across an experiment that led me to a different way of looking at these things that you may or may not be interested in. I came across an MRI imaging where they had taken people who felt very passionately about particular ideologies or issues, and they had put in front of them a challenge to the way they thought, ideas that counteracted things that they felt very, very emotional about. And what do you think had happened in the brains of these people who were being challenged in this way? Their brains literally froze. They could not take in information that was going to challenge how they believed. And this was the MRI showing how fundamentalists react when we challenge them. And that led me to wonder whether or not the way in which our minds had been physically and hormonally shaped by our previous developments had left scars in us that made it so much more difficult for us to behave with dignity towards each other. I'm not the first to start exploring this. Google and Apple are way, way before me in trying to look at how to get us to buy things that buy into our subliminal needs, our subliminal desires, and they're often very effective. But I was also very interested that the Conservative government, or the Labour government, when it came into power last time in the UK, it set up what they called a behavioural insights unit, and what we all called the nudge unit. And you know, of course, Cass Sustein has written a book called Nudge. How do we nudge people into behaving better than they normally behave? Are there things we can learn about how to do this? Some of us find this idea distasteful, but when I tell you that the very way in which they redesigned the opportunity to give up your kidney if you had an accident so that you had to opt out rather than opt in, meant that we had 100,000 extra kidneys available for us through the work of this nudge unit. This isn't to turn away the idea from what I've mostly written about in my life, which is looking at the kind of contexts that persuade people to behave better towards each other. I actually think, I mean, most of my students are international. We've had about 60 different nationalities in our classes. I think this year we've about 17. I've at least 5 students who've seen their whole families killed in front of them. I have students who pick up the phone to hear their cousins have been kidnapped. They come from Syria and Lebanon, Afghanistan. Their cousins get killed with regularity. They go and fight in foreign fields. So I have come to think that in a way it's a luxury to live in societies that we do live in, which actually mean that we don't have to lie to stay alive. We don't have to steal to feed our families. And we don't have to kill to protect our families. Because these are the choices that many of our students and millions of people face in their lives. I think I read that 1.5 billion of us live in situations that are both poor and conflict-ridden. And the kind of challenges they throw up, I see in many of the students who come to us. I've spent the last 6 months trying to look at what neuroscience can tell us that can help us as peace builders. And I think I've come up with 4 things that we need to remember. The first one is that, as you probably know, we have 2 regions of our brains that are fighting with each other. If I asked you who is in charge of your minds, I just want to remind those of you who meditate, don't you sometimes wonder who on earth is in charge of your mind as you try to settle to meditate? As ideas and thoughts and emotions come rushing by. The reality is, of course, that the prime mover in our minds is our amygdala, which is the one that deals with emotions and memories and fears. It's a very old part of our brain. It works on instincts. It's why we notice difference immediately when people sit beside us who look a little different. It's why we rise when we hear noises. That's one part of our brain. And then we have a more minor part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex. That is the one that takes account of language and abstract reasoning, that looks at strategies about how we might move ahead. And these 2 are continually in conflict with each other. I think one author, Jonathan Haidt, has called them the elephant and the rider being that tiny person who sits atop that emotional amygdala. Or I think it's also, another author refers to it as fast and slow thinking. Our fast thinking about others is often based on what we have needed to keep us alive during our evolution as human beings. Our slow thinking is the second kind of thinking that was mentioned by some of our speakers, the thoughtful thinking that helps us to realize that, in fact, we are not in the immediate danger that we think we are. Those of us who have bad tempers, does anyone here admit to that? Those who find it difficult to control our eating habits, does anyone admit to that? Often wonder who on earth is in charge of these. It certainly doesn't feel like us. So these 2 coexist very uneasily, and one of the things is we actually don't realize how powerful they are. Maybe you're lucky enough never to have been in a riot situation. If you've been in a riot situation, it is very frightening, and I guarantee you may not know yourself afterwards. In Britain and the riots in 2012, the summer riots, when so many people were out on the streets, they were throwing stones, they were stealing, and many of them were charged by the police. And when they came to court, many of them, middle-class, intelligent, educated people, said, I don't know what came over me. I became a different person. So again, I say to you, we are lucky that we are not caught up in riots. And so easily we can see how genocides happen if we understand how much fear can drive us to when our thinking has not got time to take account of our fears. And of course, most of our peace-building work, even that which we see as anger that groups express towards each other, it's much more productive to see that as fear. fear in all of the situations, even where people seem most powerful, it is often fear that is driving them. The second thing that was useful for me to find out was that we actually have different kinds of brains. This may sound like heresy, but I have wondered for years, and I've always in my teaching taken account of the fact that we learn differently. Some people see, some people hear. But also learning for some people is a joy, learning new things, risk-taking, meeting new people, and eating new foods. But only certain people like that. Other people much more prefer the steady, daily ritual that is more traditional. They like things to be safe. They like things to be secure. And often we are born one way or the other. It's not to say we can't change because of our context, but that predisposition is there and often affects how we think. If, for instance, we are instinctually more conservative, you begin to understand how we will prefer security methods that keep us safe, how we will fear immigration, that we will fear the new. Helps you maybe to understand how Republicans in the Tea Party feel when they see their white, male Christian society gradually disintegrating in front of them. Much more to see that as fear for what they are losing. So if we look at the difference between these brains, the other things I think we need to know is that conservatism is mostly what keeps societies together. There's a theory among a lot of the researchers that the whole question of being more liberal is actually a luxury that is often more available to us when we live in a society like this, where we can walk out and know that we are relatively safe. It is extraordinary to many of our students that they can walk around Cambridge or Somerville and actually be safe. It's amazing that their doors are not broken in more often, either with security forces or by thieves. And in those sorts of societies, it is so much harder to think about welcoming the new. So those MRI scans also, they can actually, if we put you into one of these MRI scanners, they can tell us how you react to new things, how you react to uncertainty, whether you're afraid of it or whether you're not. The interesting thing about this is that it can be changed by things like 9/11. They've done some experiments and realized that people who were more naturally seen to be liberals before 9/11 actually become more conservative. The whole question of fear, what's going to happen in our country? Do I need to think differently? Thomas Jefferson has actually been referred to in some of the literature as our first neuropolitician because he too wondered, did people have different brains? The president was convinced that the hardened federalists he opposed were suffering from damaged brains and diseased minds, which rendered them incapable of supporting healthy social growth. He suggested that they were nervous persons whose languid nerve fibers have more analogy with a passive than an active state of things. I would be interested if Jefferson were alive today, if he would like to try using MRI and see that it was, to a certain extent, bearing out what he says. The third thing was why we believe what we believe. Why do you believe what you believe? You think it's true. When my students come, we have a sort of an us and them exercise. And it turns out that pretty well every year, we have a third of our students are Christians, a third of our students are Muslims, and then we have a mixture of Hindus, Buddhists, Indigenous African, atheists, agnostics, and Jewish. And when you ask them, how did you come to believe what you believe? They look at each other and they realize that most of what they believe comes from where they were born. Before, they thought it was true. Now they think it's because they were born. I was interested, Charlie, I think you said you're a Unitarian. Well, I then tell them that we have one professor, Professor Ted Johnson, who's a Unitarian, and they suddenly say, oh, well, that's what we'll have to become. Because to take account of the different faith perspectives, they realize that they believe what they believe mostly because of where they were born. The other thing is realizing that many of you who've sat down to talk with fundamentalists about their beliefs have realized you actually don't get very far talking facts. You know, they stick to where they are. They sort of are closed against what you believe. They don't want to change their minds. And a lot of us realize that this is in fact based much more, not on facts, but on group needs. Almost any ideology will suffice to give a group a focus. One of the things that intrigued me was we had young loyalists who were out killing Catholics because they thought, well, first of all, there was one group who thought they were the lost tribe of Israel, who believed God had given Northern Ireland to the Protestants, and therefore their duty was to murder Catholics and chase them all out of Northern Ireland. But there were also quite a few who were convinced that the Battle of the Boyne, which happened in 1690, in which their side had won, they were convinced it was in the Bible that was written 2,000 years ago. So the whole question of what are facts, if you look at some of the young men who've gone to fight with IS and who went to fight previously with IS and with jihadist groups in Syria, conversations with them, they actually hardly know who they're fighting. Yeah. Some are actually saying, is this Syria? Is this where we are? And who's the enemy? So it's not based on the question of facts. I came across this particularly in Northern Ireland, where I discovered our Protestant majority, who are a minority within the whole of the island, who have a lot of power, have had a lot of power in the north, but are gradually losing it, began to talk about a group in history called the Cruheen, who had initially, they said, come from Scotland to Northern Ireland and then went back to Northern Ireland. And that meant that they were, it was appropriate, it was right for them to stay in Northern Ireland. And the historians were going crazy about this because there really was no evidence of any such group. So if you try and understand the facts that people believe in, it's often much less productive than trying to understand why they need those facts. In the case of the Protestants in Northern Ireland, they needed the facts to try and assure them that it was okay for them to stay there in Northern Ireland to where they had come 300 years ago. And if you see that understanding about why people have certain facts, then you begin to have different ways of looking at their needs, which is much, much more productive. I could go on, because I'm a social psychologist, and tell you about everything that group needs give to us. We desperately need to belong to a group. I remember when I first moved into my husband's background context in Northern Ireland. It was, as I said, it was a small rural community. And I assumed that I was the outsider. So then I had children and I began to talk to other women who told me that they also felt they were outsiders because they'd moved in from 10 miles down the road. And eventually, when we talked about who were the insiders, we decided it was possibly two groups at the bottom who lived by the lake shore who'd been there the longest. And it just so happened that these were ardent Republicans who believed in a violent struggle. And therefore, people were very afraid that they would be seen as outsiders if they challenged them. And this, of course, is one of the problems that you see in groups like the diaspora, who are often much more passionate than people who live in a place, because they want to belong. They want to belong so much, they will often be harder and much less able to deal with compromises sometimes than the people who live there. Now, we've also MRI studies that show that when you have contradictions, as I've said, to your deeply held beliefs, you do often feel disturbed and negative, but your reasoning doesn't start working. And this will lead to one of the suggestions that I make as to how we might think about how we use this information. We often, of course, are afraid to recognize our biases. Now, I don't know who any of you are. It's wonderful to meet a group where I know how so few of you are. I suspect not many of you listen to Fox News. Hands up, anyone who listens. I do. I need to know what Fox News says. We've one person at the back, maybe for the same reason. So if I were to look at, do you read the Washington Times or the New York Post? Would I be wrong in suggesting it's probably the New York Times? If I suggest that some of you look at MSNBC, even though they actually agree with you, and maybe you should be looking at people who don't agree with you, we do everything we can to affirm our beliefs. Very few of us move outside of circles of reading or thinking or listening that actually challenge where we are. And therefore, you can understand why people who live within very small groups don't seek to be challenged. When the peace agreements were coming in Northern Ireland, Several groups were actually approached by Sinn Féin, who were the speakers for the paramilitaries, and they wanted NGOs, the community groups, to go and talk to the remaining paramilitaries who didn't realize that the time for peace had come. Because they lived in such small circles, they did not realize the world was changing around them. And it's very hard if you just talk to the same people every day in the same group every day. And those connections are so strong. One of the things that utterly stunned me, it doesn't stun me now because I appreciate it, was all of the paramilitaries, either Protestant or Catholic that I spoke to, all said to me, shamefacedly when they were speaking to me privately, that they had never felt more alive than when they were out on a night of action, which is bombing and shooting. It pushed them to be heroic. It pushed them to bond with their peers. It gave them all the things that society did not give. And it was very difficult for them to let that go. When I looked at people who'd moved out of those kinds of groups, they were often bereft. They had nowhere in their community to hide. They had no friends who were in the middle. It was very, very difficult. So often the substance of what we believe is not as important as those with whom we share our beliefs. In fact, fundamentalism has been described by some researchers as a team sport, treated as a team sport, rather than actually trying to address the beliefs. The final one I want to look at is the big question of who is my neighbor? Now, you may be feeling, after we've had some inspirational speeches from Andrea and Charlie, you may be feeling very open and warm towards the people who are in this room. Your oxytocin levels have probably been raised. Because we know that these levels are raised if we're with a group that we feel at one, that we cooperate, that we really feel we can connect with, that they feel like friends, we share the same values, etc. Oxytocin can make you much more generous, trusting, and compassionate because your bonding as a group is assisted by oxytocin. And actually, this is probably an evolutionary leftover, that oxytocin has enabled some groups to thrive better than others, because if you feel you're fighting for the one cause, the one group, then in fact you probably were more successful than those across the hill who hadn't got their act together, as it were. The only problem about oxytocin is that while it promotes generous, warm feelings within a group, it does the opposite to people who are outside the group. It does the opposite. So you actually feel very different. And we know that Putnam here, Bowling Alone, who's written a book, shows that the tighter the bonding is within a group, the harder it often is to bridge. So the more oxytocin you can get from a group, the harder it can be for you to meet and understand and treat with dignity other people. So much so that we seem to have evolved for cooperation, and that at least is good. That's been coming out in the last 10 years. The selfish gene is being debunked, you'll be glad to hear. But only cooperation, only with some people and not with others. The other, and some people suggest we're actually wired for tribalism. The other bit of this is the whole question of mirror neurons. I could see Andrea was so upset when he was talking about a particular incident that he had encountered. He was feeling empathy, enormous empathy for the person he was talking about. And you may have had those feelings many times today. That is your mirror neurons, helping you to understand how other people feel. And normally, this is the way we are, except when we're with people we perceive as the enemy, and literally, our mirror neurons do not work. They do not work. We close them off. We don't feel empathy. It was interesting that we've had some studies here in MIT helped by a project called Justice in Times of Transition. I think it's called Beyond Violence now. And they brought together Palestinians and Israelis. And they had them go through some fantastic contact dialogue work. And they discovered that dialogue does indeed help in terms of people understanding each other. But there's a problem. So if you are a Palestinian, you feel empathy towards Israelis when you hear them listening to your story. If you are an Israeli, you feel empathy to Palestinians when you are listening to their story. So the less powerful group feels empathy when you listen to them, and the more powerful when they're listening to the less powerful group. And this has real implications for how we actually establish our dialogue projects. And this is one of the ways in which the MRI can actually help us. That asymmetrism actually is a real problem if we're not aware of it. So these kind of categorizations are the things that have helped us to group together and to kill each other. And very often it happens in such a short time. How many of you have said, but in former Yugoslavia, people were living together for decades. The war came, families were split, neighbors were split, the whole country fell apart. Because what happened was people became afraid, they checked into their memories of long ago, and suddenly you had what you have was the common killing between them. We also think that our attachment to leaders may have come about because we actually work more effectively if we have leaders. The other thing that the evidence shows us, and you may laugh at this, is that actually we prefer leaders who are very certain about what they believe. We really don't like leaders who involve themselves in too much consultation or who appear to be uncertain. It's been fascinating listening to Fox News going on and on about how terrible Obama was over the whole question of IS and Syria. They weren't checking him on the substance. They were saying, we wish he had shown himself to be stronger. You know, they miss Bush, who showed himself to be the big protector. They don't understand somebody who actually consults people and thinks long and hard. They want somebody who is pretty certain in what they believe. And therefore, our gut instincts go for a leader when there's a problem where fear is in play. So I've been trying to think, and a lot of these, by the way, a lot of the researchers themselves will recognize a lot of these are fairly tentative. And I have been trying to tentatively think the so what question. I don't like academics who write things and do no so what. So I'm doing my own so what. I think we are fooling ourselves by and large by thinking that people change because we reason with them and we write books. As someone who's written 5 books, I'm giving up. I do it for my pleasure. I do it for other academics who might occasionally read them, though less and less. But frankly, books persuade very few. My own research showed that approximately 15% of people change because they've reasoned. The rest change because of experience, because they have emotional experiences that have challenged what they believe, etc., etc. So the only assurances of greater security can help people to listen. This is why ceasefires are actually very helpful. We may knock them, but even after a month or 2 or 3, we actually can begin to listen a bit more. The second thing is, if our neural architecture, those that are more afraid of uncertainty versus those who love risk-taking, and there's a continuum, if that is true, we need very different methods for different groups. In other words, if you have somebody who is uncertain and feels afraid, frankly, shouting at them just makes them close up. I've been fascinated by people who, even my own students who think that persuading others means giving them really good arguments about why they should change what they think. In fact, that often is not very effective. I think if you create contexts where people can behave better, I mean, those of you, I hope some of you have read Steven Pinker's marvelous book called Better Angels of Our Human Nature. It's a wonderful book. And basically, Steven says something that I've seen for myself. If you create contexts where people treat each other fairly and equal opportunities for people, and people are included, you are infinitely less likely to have conflicts. And that is what is happening in many of our countries today. No wonder Norway is the most tolerant towards immigration, because they actually have very trusted institutions that manage that process of inclusion. I think we need to learn a lot more about heightening oxytocin and trust levels. As a mediator, for instance, I was doing something recently with very senior Palestinians and Israelis in Istanbul. It was a couple of years ago. And the people who were funding it were very determined, because it was very expensive, that everybody should work really hard from morning till night. And I was saying, no, we have to have things in between, such as going to the hammam together, for the women going shopping, having food. Drink wasn't an issue here, but in other places would be drink. All these opportunities to actually let our oxytocin levels develop. And I can trace many a peace agreement that goes back to individual personal sharing. It's fascinating where leaders met together and shared their common humanity, and that enabled them to actually go on and make peace agreements. But we often don't pay enough attention to what raises collective oxytocin levels. Actually, the evidence is if you create societies where people are commonly focused on mutual issues of concern, you're much less likely to actually have people fall apart into conflict. So what we did in Northern Ireland, we would not give any public money if they could not prove that different groups were going to gain equally, but also that they provided opportunities for common interaction between people. So it was a public commercial centre. It had to be one that had entrances on both sides so people could go in and meet there. If it was transport, we had to have transport that would move through all the communities and not just into the city centre, which divided people. So doing everything to promote that kind of common interaction and developing common trust. Second last, recognize that solutions are actually rarely the problem. I have worked in many, many peace processes. Frankly, I'm exhausted with all the filing cabinets I have full of solutions for Northern Ireland, for the Middle East, for Indonesia, etc., etc. Solutions, they need to be there, but they're not usually the problem. The problem is getting people to go there and getting them to feel that they can do this with some trust and some hope that they actually can work together. And then they can start to look at the solutions. I think that the final thing I want to say is that what I have learned from this is how compassionate we need to be each other as a human race. We have been left with genetic tendencies that make it easy for us to see us and them, make it easier than we would want it to be to fall apart into violence. We also have been left with tendencies that do enable us to cooperate. So we have both those that prevent us from treating with people with dignity and those that enable us to treat people with dignity. But we have to work very hard at understanding the second. We have to work very hard at the societies that we create, not just individual relationships, that those societies actually have opportunities of the kind that you and I have within this room for being at our best with each other and not at our worst. And inevitably, we will fall, but with that same compassion, we have to go up again and again and make those societies even better next time. Thank you.